welcome. Hello, hello, and welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, and happy Halloween for those who celebrate. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us today. How are we all? Thank you for joining us on this very rainy Wednesday that we have today. Thank you for joining us as part of our My Edspace Othello unit. This is actually our last lesson on Othello. Next week we'll be on half term, and then we'll be moving to A Streetcar Named Desire, another one of the most common A-level texts across the different exam boards. So looking forward, hopefully, to seeing more of you. Hello, Miranda. Thank you for joining us. Looking to see more of you going forward in our next unit in the course, which is A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. There will be a lot of cool stuff to start with there. If you haven't read it, feel free to give it a read over half term so that you're able to join in with us as much as possible, and should also be a good spot of revision for anyone who is perhaps in year 13 or beyond and thinking about mocks or exams coming up. It is that time of year. So today we will be looking for our final lesson, as we did in our last lesson, at essays and essay writing at A-level and what this looks like. So because, of course, this free stream is available not only to you wherever you are, but to anyone of any exam course or exam specification, because our aim is to provide a deeper and broader experience and engagement with the text than you're able to have in most A-level courses, because you're not able to take the extra 3 hours that we joyfully have every week to speak about this. So this lesson, the question I've created that we're going to be looking at for the exam practice or the essay practice is more along the lines of the AQA structure. Hello, IGCSE. Welcome, welcome. I'm well, thank you. Happy Halloween. So as I said, this is based more on the AQA structure, whereas our last lesson was based more on the Edexcel structure. They do look slightly different, so I did want to show you that, and the fact that though they are slightly different questions and slightly different format of questions, really what you're doing for A-level literature is very much the same. So let's get into it for Essays 2, Lesson 16. And if this is your first time joining, I am Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My Edspace. I will be providing these free streams across the year for Key Stage 5 students, which hopefully as well, we will be moving towards providing more free streams from other subjects as well across the year. So a benefit not only if you're looking to improve your English or looking to improve your studying, your revision for A-level, but also if you are taking other A-levels, you'll also have access to even more content completely free from My Edspace. Read Just Learning English Language and Literature, had to read the book. Fantastic, Miranda. So you do know. Great. So looking forward to hopefully seeing you on that course as well. So, as I said, this is me. If this is your first time joining, feel free to take a look back at your previous videos that should be in your suggested for you. There are 15 other free streams from our lessons over the course of September and October, all covering all aspects of Othello, covering plot, character, tragedy, themes, critics, argument creation, etc. So all of that is completely available to you as well. You're here just for fun, even better, just for the joy of English, joy of the game. Love to see it. Okay, so let's take a look at these questions to get us started. Firstly, what could be considered Othello's Hamartia? Now, I know this question came up last lesson, but I want us to review it because there is so much one could say, but I also want to clarify what Hamartia is, because it seemed people were a little bit uncertain about that word last lesson. Then Question 2, how does Iago make Othello jealous? How is Othello affected by jealousy? So in other words, what does that jealousy look like? Who else is affected by jealousy in the play? What is the proof Iago provides of Desdemona's infidelity? Take a moment, pop into the chat your ideas. They don't have to be full sentences, they don't have to be essays, just ideas. Even if you want to check to see if you're right, feel free to pop into the chat, and I will give you just a minute for that. And then we'll get talking. Okay, so most famously, people, scholars, teachers, English students will say that Othello's hamartia is jealousy. Is jealousy because it's his jealousy that drives him to murder his wife and eventually to his own destruction as well. However, we can say it's something slightly different, a different version or different part of what this jealousy is. So we could also say that it is his insecurities, the fact that he's so vulnerable to attacks on his manhood, his reputation, his position in society, that he is much more vulnerable to attacks by Othello in terms of the mind games and manipulation that Iago enacts upon him. Miranda, hamartia is the fatal flaw that leads to someone's downfall. So hamartia is that something, some negative characteristic, negative trait that in a tragedy, stemming from Greek tragedy, drives the character to their end. For the most part, this was viewed or is viewed as an internal flaw, so some kind of failing of their personal character. So for example, jealousy, if they're a really jealous person. Hubris, IGCSE, yes, could be considered a type or a version of hamartia, because hubris is excessive pride, right? So the pride that goes before a fall, like Icarus, we could say his hamartia is hubris. Absolutely. So you could say, yes, naivete, Miranda, 100%, this willingness to believe in anyone who tells him anything about his own wife, or willingness even as well to believe that his wife would do this. As well, could it be his love of Desdemona? And that could be twofold in thinking, oops, apologies, my pen is a little tricky today. Must be Halloween. Desdemona. And we could think of this as a kind of, he loves her so much that when he thinks that she's betrayed him, he spins into this fury and ends it for them both. Or we can think that this is a lack of love for her, a lack of real love, or perhaps idealized love that should be real love instead. Those kinds of ideas, or no love, misplaced love, etc. We could also think that his control or self-control as well is his hamartia, because he so readily swings into this incredibly and intensely violent and harsh character from someone who is not already. Could we think of his perhaps prizing of his reputation? As his hamartia, because it's when this is threatened and what he seeks to try and reclaim it is also part of what drives him to his downfall, his fear perhaps of losing his reputation, etc. There have been several times in the last couple of years questions about fear, Othello's fear, except fear in the play, etc., which means that we can definitely think of that as a kind of workaround of these same ideas. Because what would the fear be of? Fear of his reputation being lost, fear of his wife cheating on him, or cuckoldry, fear of his outsider's position, fear of this monster he fears becoming, this kind of thing. Then question 2, how does Iago make Othello jealous? Well, in simplest terms, by manipulating him into believing that his wife is unfaithful. And not only unfaithful full stop, but with his best friend. And as we've said previously, there's this idea of, within Shakespearean tragedies in particular, this kind of double betrayal. In which it's not only that the woman he loves most deceives him and betrays him, but that she does this with his best friend, who he also supposedly trusts. So this double betrayal of best friend and wife together. It's quite sly personality. Miranda, 100%. Yes, he's very suggestive. In fact, it is, I believe, Honigman who says that Iago is a very seductive character. Yes. So what do we mean by that? We mean that Iago does a lot of this harm by suggesting the opposite. So when he says, "Oh, was it Cassio who knows your wife well?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Oh, he seems like he does." But if we know the kind of nuances of Jacobean English, we know that that know well, if you're studying GCSE, you may also know from When We Two Parted, Byron, is that idea of knowing in a biblical sense. So having had sex with. So there's all this kind of play on words, this crafty language. Exactly. How he crafts these fake scenarios is just awful, Miranda. 100%. And that is really speaking to this idea then of Bloom's as being Iago being a director of the play, or a director of evil, as Bloom says. So he creates these little mini scenes where he knows that everyone is completely innocent of what he's implying them to do, but it seems like there could be something suspicious going on here if you don't have all of the information. And Iago is very crafty in only giving the information that he wants to give. That's why, for example, his asides are such an important part of his presentation, because Shakespeare is giving us the information without him giving it to the other characters. So this idea of who knows what and who is complicit in this scheme, and what information is actually real, or are we another kind of Othello to Iago, who is also able to be deceived into thinking Iago is something he's not? Are they enemies or something? Who, Iago and Othello? They're meant to be friends, and they're meant to be particularly pretty good friends and people who've served together in the military for a long time. Othello makes the seemingly grievous error of not promoting Iago instead of, and it instead promotes Cassio. And Iago seems to act on this. Also, we could say he has very racist tendencies and he just wants to destroy Othello because he's black and has married a white woman. It seems that Iago hates Othello. He gives us many reasons why. Different critics believe different ideas about who hates who loves whom, and whether Iago is actually justified in his hatred of Othello. But Othello completely trusts Iago, calls him honest Iago, says he loves him, etc. So it's a bit of a tricky one there. Then how is Othello affected by jealousy? So what does his jealousy look like? Well, first of all, he initially doesn't believe it. So he says, away at once with love or jealousy. But then this doubt starts to sink in. And then this questioning, both of himself and, as we can see, pretty viciously, of Desdemona. Also a kind of persistent questioning of Iago about this, and to the point that Iago says, well, what do you want to do? Interrupt them seeing them in the middle of cheating on you? I don't think so. You're just going to have to take my word for it. He also questions Emilia, for example, all of whom give him the answers he wants to hear, other than Iago, who says, well, okay, she said that. Loads of people say things that aren't actually true. Wouldn't be her, but okay. So then that trickiness of he's validating it but undermining it at the same time. What else? It acts as a poison. It starts to change him fundamentally and change him in a really negative way. This looks like becoming more violent, becoming more cruel with Desdemona in particular, to the point that she is slapped in front of people from Venice. Wasn't once evidence, but Iago proves it. Yeah, them. Yes, exactly, Miranda. Yes, so this doubts, cruelty, violence, he becomes insecure, for sure, and then he starts to become monstrous. And all of that language of Act 1, calling Othello monstrous, evil, enchanter, witchcraft, chains of magic, etc., seems to become true, because he does become bestial or beast-like. He becomes monstrous. His vision is affected, right? He cannot see the truth. Didn't take any other solution, just kill them. Getting very cruel. Miranda, yes, and immediately, right? He becomes insecure and uncertain and doubtful, and then all of a sudden he becomes decisive as well. And he says, well, to be once in doubt is to be once resolved. I've doubted once, so I know what I have to do now. Let me, he says, furnish myself with a swift means of death for the fair devil. So this idea that he is premeditating this murder, that he views as a sacrifice and not as a murder in cold blood, because he thinks it's justified. Then what do we get to at the end? This idea of him being completely corrupted by violence, fear, anger, power, control, doubt, jealousy, etc. And he is destroyed at the end. And that can take many forms there. This idea of him being destroyed because he commits suicide, but also his reputation is destroyed, his future is destroyed, his marriage is destroyed, his wife is destroyed, his friendships and relationships are destroyed. He tries to get Cassio killed as well, remember. Cassio thankfully survives. And even his final speech, he's aware of the fact that his reputation has been destroyed, because he says, well, when you're talking about me, when you're reporting this all back to Venice, remember, I actually did do some good things in my life too. Think of me with that as well. Don't just think of me as someone who killed their wife and went crazy. Then, question 4, who else is affected by jealousy in the play? So we have Othello both as a kind of victim of jealousy and as a jealous person. Iago creates this jealousy, perhaps, arguably, but also Othello is jealous himself. Who's also jealous? Iago. As he says, he thinks that Othello had an affair with his wife Emilia. He's also perhaps jealous of Cassio, who had the position that he wants. Is he also potentially sexually jealous of either Cassio or Othello? Yes, definitely. Miranda, you said he gets very self-conscious, like questioning why she would betray him. 100%. So even sort of questioning his own humanity, right? As I believe it is Bradshaw who says. So Iago, definitely. We also have Iago's little helpmate in some of this, Roderigo, who wanted to marry Desdemona, not seemingly out of real good love, or real morally good love is what I mean. He seems sort of fixated with her. He seems like a pest at the beginning. He's lovesick. He's one of the sort of clownish elements of the play, because he's so silly in his love. He's like, I'm going to drown in my tears, kind of over dramatic nonsense. But he is also, his jealousy also manifests in an ugly way. He helps to goad Brabantio into taking this to the court, and perhaps lays the groundwork for Iago's ability to place doubt in Othello's mind. We also, to a certain extent, have Brabantio, right? And perhaps not the same kind of jealousy that Iago has or Othello has, because he's not Desdemona's husband or lover of any kind, but he is her father. And this idea of jealousy doesn't just cover sexual jealousy, it also covers possessive jealousy. And he thinks of her as something of his. That's why it's so telling that Iago says, look, and Roderigo say, look to your bags, your daughter, your house, etc. Thieves, thieves. So this idea foregrounded that Desdemona is a possession of his for him to look out for and also to use when the time comes for her to be married. That is a transactional purpose she serves for him. So it really is like he is that he is thinking of her as a kind of possession that he needs to jealously keep to himself, possessively keep to himself. At some point, Iago liked Desdemona. Yes, he does say that at one point. He says he lusts after her. In Cinthio's version, so the short story by Cinthio, who was an Italian writer from whom Shakespeare got his inspiration in part, the ensign, which is what Iago is called in that version, does love Desdemona, as it's pronounced in that play, and with an I instead of an E. But and that's the reason that he tries to get revenge on Othello. Here, it doesn't seem like he's been in love with Iago. Doesn't seem like Iago's been in love with Desdemona for years and Othello swoops in and takes her at all. It seems like he's just being malicious, as Coleridge says, motiveless malignity. And then we also have here Bianca. Bianca, who is Cassio's lover, potential sex worker, who is jealous of his attentions to other people and is part of the crux of the play about the handkerchief, as Reimer says. This idea that she is jealous, that she can't control Cassio's seemingly wandering eye, and when he asks her to take out the stitches or the design of Desdemona's handkerchief that he's found in his room because he likes the pattern, he essentially tells her, can you make a copy of this because I like it? And when whoever it is realizes it's missing and wants it back, I want one with the same design. This, of course, is the handkerchief that Iago has planted in Cassio's room in order to frame him and Desdemona. But it's Bianca's jealousy that leads her to throw this handkerchief back in his face in one of these scenes, as Miranda said, these fake scenarios that Othello is watching from a distance, and he sees the handkerchief being thrown back at Cassio, saying, this is from one of your other women, make her do it. How dare you tell me to do work? And essentially giving me evidence that you are sleeping with other people as well. At some point, everyone is jealous maybe, but some, it's like an illness. Miranda, thank you. Yes, because as we've seen in previous lessons, we can think of this jealousy as we said, corrupted, but as this kind of poison or plague for not only Othello, but also some of the other characters like Iago. This plague and poison motifs that carry across the play really are carried in this metaphor of jealousy being a kind of poison or plague that not only affects someone, but it makes them sick, it disturbs their vision, it brings them to, in Othello's instance, into an epileptic fit, so physically affecting them, and then eventually kills them and causes them lots of pain. So absolutely so, yes. And then, as we said, already referencing for question 4, the proof of Desdemona's infidelity, the handkerchief. The handkerchief that's spotted with strawberries. It's implied that it's white, which is spotted with strawberries. What is this meant to symbolize? But Desdemona's purity and her virginity, because as Newman says, it is sufficient proof in the Jacobean era of a woman's adultery if a man has her handkerchief. So the fact that Cassio has it is sufficient proof for Othello, and is also meant to symbolize, with the whiteness, her purity, and with the spotted with strawberries, her loss of virginity, so her corruption, in other words. Literally the same way that blood or this red sort of stains the white of that handkerchief. It's very much the same way that marital bed sheets would be stained with a consummation of marriage, and the way that Othello, guided by Iago, is planning to stain Desdemona's wedding bed when he kills her in it. That he feels is justice. Right, so we've got loads of ideas about jealousy, which is great because that means that we can include lots of these different ideas and organize ourselves really well in terms of thinking about consolidating this into a written format. Now, what do the questions look like? So this is my own creation of a question, but it's drawn from the structure of AQA questions. In AQA, they give you an extract, unlike in Edexcel. They give you an extract, but you don't have a choice of question. You have this one question broken down into 2 bullet points. Be careful of that. It's not just asking you to answer the one, but both. The instructions are to read the extract from Shakespeare's Othello and then discuss the following. How does Shakespeare present the marriage of Othello and Desdemona? And how does Shakespeare present their love across the play? So, several bits we have to do there. We have to address how the marriage is presented in this extract and then across the play. So let's take a look at the extract first. I would always suggest reading the question before reading the extract so that you know what you're looking for, right? And we know what we're looking for here. As we can see, the marriage of the two. So we're looking for how it's represented, and then their love across the play. So if we think about the trajectory of their love, ideas are already spinning to mind, right? We're thinking, oh, beginning, really loving, perhaps a little bit idealized, passionate, active, etc. Then doubt, insecurity, questioning, betrayal, destruction of the marriage, death at the end. So we're seeing a trajectory happening already. Then let's look at the extract. Desdemona says, "Who's there, Othello?" "I, Desdemona." "Will you come to bed, my lord?" "Have you prayed tonight, Desdemon?" "I, my lord." "If you bethink yourself of any crime unreconciled as yet to heaven and grace, solicit for it straight." So we know where this is from now. We know this is from the final scene, Act 5, Scene 2, because this is when Othello is coming in. He's just given his first brief monologue looking at the sleeping Desdemona and saying, she looks so beautiful, you couldn't believe that she is impure, but I must do this. I'm committed to doing this, or else she'll betray more men. But I won't spill her blood. I'll keep her perfect and white and pure as she looks now. But I must do this. And so immediately, this is after that, when she says she wakes, is at the end of it. Who's there? Othello. Okay, so we're grounding ourselves now in where we are in the play. And then let's continue reading. And anything you'd want to talk about from this extract that tells you something about their relationship, pop it in the chat. Okay, so who's there? Othello? I, Desdemona. Will you come to bed, my lord? Have you prayed tonight, Desdemon? I, my lord. If you bethink yourself of any crime unreconciled as yet to heaven and grace, solicit for it straight. Alack, my lord, what do you mean by that? Well, do it, and be brief. I will walk by. I would not kill thy unprepared spirit. No, heavens forfend, I will not kill thy soul. Talk you of killing? Aye, I do. Then heaven have mercy on me. Amen, with all my heart. If you say, I hope you will not kill me. Humph, thou art on thy deathbed. And yet I fear you, for you are fatal then when your eyes roll so. Why should I fear I know not, since guiltiness I know not, but yet I feel I fear. Think on thy sins. They are loves I bear to you. Aye, and for that thou diest. That death's unnatural that kills for loving. Alas, why gnaw so your nether lip? Some bloody passion shakes your very frame. These are portents, but yet I hope they do not point on me. Peace, and be still. I will so. What is the matter? That handkerchief which I so loved and gave thee, thou gavest to Cassio. No, by my life and soul, send for the man and ask him. Sweet soul, take heed of perjury. Thou art on thy deathbed. Good, so Miranda immediately noticing here the difference in referential strategies, which means the ways in which the characters are referring to each other here. And here, notice, it wouldn't be uncommon for a husband or a wife to call her husband my lord, but certainly, especially in reference and in regard to Othello's referential strategies with her, this really does establish a power dynamic. So we do have here, I was just checking to make sure there was nothing else here, and even we've got the my lords here, and we've also got you. We've got Othello here at the beginning as well, but it's almost as if she doesn't recognize him or how he's come in, etc., which it shows this A, deference, but B, confusion of hers here in her powerlessness, her deference to him, but also the fact that he has changed so much that perhaps she doesn't recognize him. And notice as well, he does say as well, or she does say, you, if you say. And why is this important? This is important because you at this time is actually the more formal way of referring compared to thee and thou. Thee and thou was actually less formal, more informal, and was often used to describe or speak to someone who was lower in class than you. So even in this very few moments before her death, we can see that she is referring to him in this formal way that perhaps indicates the power dynamic between them, because she is very much in the passive, submissive role in this relationship. And let's look at the referential strategies then, contrastingly, of Othello's. Well, firstly, he calls her by her name, but then notice this. Have you prayed tonight, Desdemon? Shakespeare would definitely have done this on purpose, to highlight Othello's view of Desdemona in this moment, and perhaps also to highlight the contrast between Othello's view and what's real, and this change in how he can neglect to see what is really in front of him. Because he views her as a demon here, and thus this reveals how fully and fundamentally he has misplaced his trust in the wrong person, because it is only when Iago's deceit is revealed that he becomes the demi-devil and Desdemona comes to be returned to being my girl, etc. And notice as well, thee and thy, the less formal, so again, he's almost speaking down to her. Thou art on thy deathbed, for example. Maybe she was not waiting. She felt he was angry and she felt confused, blamed. Shows at some point women's weakness or do not know how to say. Miranda, yes, this idea that at this time women were expected to be this passive sort of receptacle of blame for men. So they took on the blame, they took on the punishment, even if they didn't deserve it. Many conduct books of the time, as we've looked at in our lesson on gender and blackness, and also femininity, were this idea of women expecting to be chastised by their husband, even if they hadn't done anything wrong, being grateful for this opportunity that they were given to learn and be more morally good. And notice as well in the structure of the sentences, we have a lot of questions here, a lot of questions that also show this kind of, especially with Desdemona, confusion, as Miranda said, yes, because it genuinely does seem that she doesn't know what's going on. Talk you of killing. She's like, what are you talking about killing someone for? She doesn't know, and only her beseeching of heaven really does speak to her insistence here that she's done nothing wrong. Here, 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 even this, what's the matter? Literally, what's the problem here? And here, this horror at what she is being accused of and the position she is actually in is very clear here. As well, so we have this power dynamic. If we look at how much people are speaking as well, we can see a clear power dynamic as well. Othello is, as we can see here, commanding her a lot and speaking much more than her, expecting her to pray. Have you prayed tonight? Interesting here that this is married with this idea of if you think you've done anything wrong that you haven't yet confessed, do it now. Solicit being an imperative verb there, saying beg for your forgiveness now to God, essentially get confession, which was part of the last rites for Christians at this time. Do it, be brief. We've got then this part here, then heaven have mercy on me. And Othello says, I with all my heart. That doesn't sound right? Heaven have mercy on me, but it's Othello saying, yes, I will do. Because he's killing her in a merciful way, perhaps. But what does this mean then in terms of his positioning? He's positioned as this kind of god to her, which makes sense in the power dynamic of a Jacobean marriage, because a man was the head of household and women were expected to defer. But also Othello takes this a step further. His control, his possessiveness, his jealousy, as Bradshaw says, is something that only her murder can actually get her to be completely under his control, because her life is in his hands. And here we can see that. He says, she must die or else she'll betray more men. So it's him saying, you will have to essentially pray to God, i.e. me, and I am taking my life into your hands. That was why, and is why, killing is viewed as a sin, because it's taking God's role onto yourself, being and playing God. So he says here, thou art on thy deathbed. That declarative short sentence that's so chilling. Think on thy sins. He's being both a priest, this kind of confessor, but also this kind of avenging angel here. Peace, be still. Thou art on thy deathbed. Take heed of perjury. Perjury is an interesting word here because it's a legal word. It's legalese. So why is he saying that her lying to him is perjury? Is it perjury because she's on her deathbed? And if she lies, then she'll be, and doesn't confess, she'll be going to hell? Possibly. Is it also this idea that from the start, we've been in this kind of public court with this couple in which Othello still feels this external presence of society in his marriage, and thus views all of even their most intimate moments as on this stage for society to judge. So thus this becomes a trial not of her, but for his reputation, his place in society. We can also see here the change in the relationship from the beginning, when Othello in Act 1 says, let her be witness to it, and let her explain how this whole marriage came to be. Whereas here, he says, well, here he is this monstrous creature, as Desdemona points out. This idea of fear you're fatal when your eyes roll so. Okay, eyes rolling like a beast that's out of control. Particularly, this was used to describe beasts and horses that were out of control as well, and sense inflamed. But also, if we're thinking about eyes rolling and the importance of eyes and sight in this play, perhaps we're also thinking about if someone's eyes are rolling in their head, they're not able to see straight, right? So then we have this idea of if his eyes rolling, he can't see what's right in front of her. He's calling her Desdemon. He's asking if she's prayed. She's asking, come to bed. Come, perhaps to consummate it for the first time. Transgressive Desdemona, a little bit. But we have that. He tells her to think on her sins. She says, their loves I bear to you. He can't hear that. Okay, so you die for that, for how much you love me. But here we have Desdemona calling this unnatural, nor so on your nether lip. So why are you chewing on your lip like that, on your nether lip, your bottom lip? So this idea of chewing and beastliness, teeth, consumption, as Emilia had said previously, they are but stomachs and we are food. When they're sick of us, essentially, they belch us. So this idea then of him attacking, consuming, destroying her. And then there's some bloody passion shakes your very frame. So this idea that he is literally shaking with this passion that's raising his blood, that's making him so angry, but also this idea of there's blood. This is foreshadowing of what's going to happen. Blood is going to be spilled. Also, perhaps this idea of shaking is a reference to Othello's own epileptic fit previously. And this idea that an epileptic fit would be viewed as a kind of possession of the devil, or an indication of the devil's mark on someone. So then, this, again, the devil is in him. Now, is that devil himself and his monstrous insides? Is it Iago? Is it society? Is it his insecurities? Is it jealousy? Up to your interpretation. And then we have him saying, thou art on thy deathbed. So here we have quite a few ideas just from the extract that will really help us to set up our whole essay structure. To blame for everything, maybe they pay them for their insecurity, Miranda. Totally. So well, first we have here this idea of the betrayal, right? And how Othello views Desdemona now, which is as a devil, the fair devil that he calls her earlier. We also have the power dynamic between them as being extremely one-sided. We have Desdemona as passive and Othello as controlling, violent, in power, active, etc. Very different from the beginning of the play, so we can think, ooh, contrast to the beginning. And even the middle, where it was a loving relationship, even though it was transgressive. And it seemed much more balanced at the time. For example, him saying, or Cassio saying, my captain's captain. I'm going to move myself up here a squinch. We also have the destructive consequences of this relationship, right? The mutual destruction. Of this relationship. Could we think of this beginning as an idealized love, and then this being, again, this kind of complete opposite to that, this demonized love? Absolutely. Literally demonized, as she's called Desdemon. Could we also think of this marriage as doomed from the start? Most certainly. Or fated from the start. We've looked at ideas of fate all the way through this unit on Othello, because society at the time would not have allowed Shakespeare out of that theatre if they were allowed to live happily ever after with this interracial marriage with these fears of miscegenation in Jacobean England, right? Could we think of this lack of love maybe here, maybe across the play? Him never really loving her? Can we think about this idea of Iago as a kind of poison to this relationship? For sure. Can we think of this as some kind of some kind of corrupting influence? Can we see this as an actual problem of reputation being prioritized over love or trust or Desdemona's life, really? Apologies, that's a little bit low. It says reputation greater than love there. And then can we think of this as so many different things? This is even more ideas than we have paragraphs for the time we have to do A level. So yes, we could think of this as an indicative of a patriarchal society. Yes. Could we look at Desdemona actually as the active character here, the more transgressive character in their relationship? Sure. Could we look at Othello never really loving her? Yes. There are infinite 400 years worth of criticism as to what we could do for this. Yeah. Then if we're thinking about assessment objectives, we spoke about this in our last lesson, but for your Othello question, you are marked on AO1, AO2, AO3, and AO5. AO4 is reserved for your comparative questions. This is not a comparative question. You're not comparing Othello with another text. So that does give you a slightly more room to focus on Othello, which is good for us. Now, what are these different assessment objectives? AO1 is your response to the text. So, do you know the text well? Can you quote from the text in a way that makes sense? And can you craft arguments that also make sense? And build arguments that discuss and engage with the text in a creative but also a clear way that makes sense. AO2, so that is this response to literary text, using terminology, being clear, but this idea of crafting your argument, really. In AO2, we have how meanings are shaped. So this means that this is all your devices, but much more importantly than just talking about the devices, talking about how they actually tell you something about the characters, what they are actually there to do in the text. Just talking about them doesn't get you very far at A level. In fact, it's now being indicated on the exam descriptions after the end of an exam cycle as an issue where students will just feature spot, which means that they will see, oh yeah, there's a candle here in this. That means there's a motif of light here. Cool. There is one. Great. Rather than thinking about, okay, what does this motif of light or this motif of poison actually do for talking about jealousy? How does that have anything to do with jealousy? You explaining that and engaging with that is the much more important thing to do. Then AO3, context, writer's intention. What is the writer trying to say through this presentation of jealousy, love, relationships, etc.? How would a contemporary audience react? What is it reflecting about their time period? So, for example, the patriarchal society that Miranda mentioned, particularly of Jacobean England, in which cuckoldry was a man's and a husband's biggest fear. And then also perhaps the modern audience. How might our interpretation of this be different? Because our society is different than the one 400 years ago. And then AO5, as we spent some time talking about last lesson, literary text informed, well, this is context here, context, written and received. Here we have informed by different interpretations. That means critics, which means that you need to know critical quotations off by heart in order to not only put them in your essay, but also to incorporate them into your argument. So saying, well, Coleridge says this about Iago, that he is motiveless in his malignity. Do my quotations I've used support that? Or do they subvert that? Can I argue that Coleridge actually argues the same thing as me? And is his quotation relevant to my argument? And we can see that the phrasing is, if not identical, extremely similar between the two mark schemes. So this means that across A level, you are going to be looking at the same thing. So we've started thinking about this already. But let's get these ideas on paper, because this is what you're going to do in your actual exam, right? Is look at the extract and then briefly do this. Thinking, okay, we've got loving. We've got transgressive. So, for example, Desdemona as the pursuer at the beginning. But we also have this interracial marriage. We also have jealousy. We have Iago as influencing this marriage. We have power. We have love, idealized, real, loss of. We have betrayal. We have reputation, linking to ideas of cuckoldry. we have insecurity. We also have society, right? Not just Iago, but other parts of society here influencing the marriage between them. Okay. Now, this kind of word cloud, idea map, whatever you want to call it, is a really helpful tool for your revision for not only Othello, but for all of your texts, because you can see how your ideas interweave. What do I mean by this? I mean that you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every question you are given. In fact, a lot of your ideas about jealousy, perhaps, or power will serve you well for talking about this relationship between them. Similarly, if you have an essay on power, you can use the power dynamic between Othello and Desdemona as a focus for your argument. Then you can think about Iago's power over Othello, etc. The power of jealousy, etc. I'm also going to add changes here because we really do think about that as well. So you don't reinvent the wheel. Think about what actually works to serve you. Because if we're thinking about how much time you have for these questions in the exam, you really want to have an idea of what will serve you for your different themes and ideas that could come up, right? So what do we need to include in an essay about in this relationship? We've got a bunch of ideas already. So let's think about how we can organize this, right? So first in our thesis, we're going to, using a structure that we looked at last lesson as well, think about the relationship and introduce it as one influenced by a power dynamic, one where there is love, both idealized, that is later demonized, that's influenced by jealousy, etc. We want to talk about Shakespeare's project. Is he trying to reinforce or subvert the patriarchal expectations of Jacobean England? Is he trying to reflect the extremely harsh and draconian punishments and realities for Jacobean women within marriage? Maybe. Could we say the influence of society on a relationship in the Jacobean era? Absolutely. We also want to briefly tie this to Cinthio to show off a little bit of our AO3. That would be here. This part here would really be our AO1. And in terms of thinking it tracking across the play through this theme, then that's a little bit of AO2, I guess. And then we want to think about Cinthio because then that's really flexing our AO3, our cultural contextual knowledge. Because Cinthio's version is different, right? In Cinthio's version, Desdemona and the Moor, as he is only known, they're not meant to be together. And the whole moral of Cinthio's version is keep control of your women and daughters, or else look what will happen to them. So we have that difference because it seems like Desdemona isn't really blamed for this relationship as such, but it is a loving relationship at one point, it seems. Perhaps trying to have a slightly different project. Then we can think about organizing our ideas. Because this is an extract question, we want to draw from the extract not only in one paragraph, but maybe we want to start off with that paragraph, right? So this idea of him really there, Othello demonizing and blaming Desdemona for this destruction of their marriage, etc. Then we also want to think about perhaps Iago's influence in getting to this point? Could we get into the ideas about Othello valuing and trusting Iago more than his own wife? Yeah, for sure. And then perhaps that could link us to this idea of patriarchal attitudes towards women. Jardine saying that she is completely passive, etc. We could do that there. We could also flip this around and say this is a loving, if transgressive, marriage. They do love each other. And it's actually Iago's fault that he gets in the way. We would definitely want to talk about things like Act 1, when they both speak about their love story. Perhaps Act 2, Scene 1, where they're reunited, etc. And establish this as a direct contrast or juxtaposed with the later presentational view of the marriage. We could also think of, even further back, Othello idealizing Desdemona. So really asking ourselves, does Othello see Desdemona as a person? Or is this a case of idealization where she is really the divine Desdemona, and as soon as she falls off that pedestal, she becomes the whore of the Madonna-whore dichotomy? And there we can talk about all of this contamination and filth motifs. This idea of her as being corrupted. So I'm thinking, for example, her face, which was fresh and as fresh as Diane's own visage, is now black and begrimed as mine own face. So this idea of this change having taken place. So really starting from the ending and flipping backwards. And then a couple of different things we could also talk about. We could talk about a kind of alternative argument in which Othello and Desdemona's love is actually secondary to his love for Iago, and get into some queer theory then, look at the marriage vows, the temptation scene, etc. The language he uses for him, the fact that he trusts him way more, this betrayal as being much more than just the betrayal of a friend, but of, or a military betrayal, but or professional betrayal, but rather something much more egregious to Iago's mind. Could we think about, instead of one of these, and if we feel that this actually serves us better up here, then we can use that as part of our argument about Iago's influence, and instead focus on something like the role of reputation within this marriage. We could talk about the power dynamic throughout and use perhaps a feminist lens. Could we put that within this reputation Certainly. And think of Desdemona as a kind of sacrifice for male preservation. In a social sense. So not that if he doesn't kill Desdemona, he'll die, but this idea that his reputation will suffer so much he'll essentially be socially dead. Could we also say, instead, for another paragraph, something about this fate? Their relationship as fated from the beginning. Fated from the start of the play? Sure. We definitely could. It's up to you. But it's helpful to have your ideas of what you would like to do if, for example, this question came up. It's helpful to have beforehand so that you can spend your time actually writing the analysis rather than spending your time trying to, as I said, reinvent the wheel by coming up with completely brand new arguments. It's not time for that, unfortunately, in the time you have. So let's take a look now at a thesis statement and what we can do for a thesis statement here. So as I've said in our previous lessons, you do need to have a thesis statement as part of your argument, because that is really how you show that you're able to construct a good argument. A good argument needs this introduction that shows your reader where you're going. Now, I can give you some guidance for this because it's helpful to have a structure that works for you that you can apply to basically any question that comes up. How do we do this? We do this by starting with the question itself. So the question is, how is the relationship presented? So we need to decide. It's presented as loving, doomed, corrupted, destroyed, something like that. So let's start with the, and I'll make this slightly bigger so that it's not too tiny for you to see. The loving yet doomed relationship between Othello and Desdemona in, and then, so that's our answer really, is it's loving but doomed, or loving but jealous, or loving but idealized, whatever, is a fundamental theme in Othello, as it is this relationship that, or it is the marriage that catalyzes. What does that mean? That means that starts off the reaction to, or starts off the action of, the action of the play. Bit ambiguous, not fully portrayed. How do you mean? Do you mean, Miranda, that we need to add some more detail? We will do. Remember, this is just an introduction. But if you have an idea of how you want to change the phrasing, you absolutely can do. I'm trying to give you some stock sentences that you could just swap in and out. Jealous and doomed, perhaps. It is this transgressive marriage that, though initially passionate, reveals Othello's own insecurities as well as his precarious position in Venetian society as a black Moor in Venice. Or as an outsider, we could say. A blackamoor in Venice. Married into the social elite. Okay, so what are we doing in these first two sentences? We are introducing how we view the relationship. Likely, if we're introducing it this way, we are going to use those words as in our topic sentences. So one is loving, one is jealous, one is doomed. That doesn't mean we have to put every single idea we're going to include in each of our paragraphs, but we can introduce kind of our main thinking points. And this transgressive marriage that, though initially passionate, reveals Othello's own insecurities as well as his precarious position in Venetian society as an outsider, a blackamoor in Venice, married into the white social elite, into the social elite, etc. Now, what is that sentence doing? That sentence is just explaining that the marriage is important to the action of the play. We know that in our heads, but unless we demonstrate that to our examiner, they don't know that we know that. And we can continue this sentence even a little bit more. Yeah, this is so generally characters, including Desdemona's attitude, seems vague sometimes. I see what you mean. Yes. Well, it's just that there are so many options for how you could interpret it, right? Shakespeare doesn't give us one interpretation that we can happily kind of leave off and know that that's right? That is definitely the harder part. That drives the play to its tragic conclusion, in which both Desdemona and Othello are violently killed. So why did I add that extra bit there? That is because I explained the importance of the marriage to the play, but then I also want to link it to the ending to show my examiners or show my readers that I am able to link the beginning of the play, the catalyst, to the middle of the play, to the ending of the play. So I'm explaining that, which in my AO1 proves that I know not only how the play ends and what happens in it. That sounds like it should be for granted, but you'd be surprised. And also this idea that we can say, oh, we know that this theme actually tracks through the whole play here. And because it appears here, here, and here. So we're essentially proving our point that we know what we're talking about here. And this tragic conclusion bit is very helpful because that immediately gets us to that point. Even if you don't explain so much about how it gets to the tragic conclusion, we know that this character and this character end up dead. Or if we're talking about Iago, that leads to the tragic conclusion of the eponymous character. So Othello, Desdemona, Emilia, or so many characters. Now, next sentence, we want to link in Shakespeare now. So we've got our first bullet point, clear addressal of the question, tick, right? We've talked about the relationship between them. We've also got a brief explanation of how this question appears in the text through argument. So we've introduced our couple of ideas we're going to talk about. Passionate, insecurities, social position, conclusion, tick. Brief analysis of the consequences, we've got it, tick. That's the tragic conclusion bit. Then we need to link to contextual factors and suggestion of the writer's intention. So Shakespeare perhaps used this theme to demonstrate the devastating consequences of interracial or jealousy within marriages, whichever you feel is more appropriate to your answer. Marriages in a society in which marriage was a bastion of social control and from which men derived their social status, power, and reputation. So what does that mean? That means that Shakespeare is showing how harmful, for example, jealousy is in a relationship that was so important to Jacobean culture and society. So let's now link Cinthio's ideas into this. So perhaps then, rather than a simple retelling of Cinthio's Desdemona and the Moor, Shakespeare here serves a more didactic purpose, which means that he has a more instructional purpose here, as he seeks to deliver a searing indictment of the power dynamics of Jacobean marriage and the Miranda, I thought you had included another idea there. It was just your last question. Indictment of the power dynamics of Jacobean marriage and the normalization of American spelling of women within marriages as sacrifices to preserve male status. So what does that mean? Then we're linking Cinthio not just retelling the story, but saying that he's actually trying to condemn these power dynamics of Jacobean marriage, and also the fact that women were it was very accepted women were used as sacrifices to preserve their men's reputation. So is that a thesis statement that can serve you for any single question? Not really, because it's too specific for our idea talking about the relationship, or talking about jealousy in the relationship, or talking about the marriage itself. But we can use those sentence starters to guide us towards any topic's thesis statement, right? So we can say something is a fundamental theme or is a fundamental character because, or as, explain why. It is this person, theme, relationship, etc. that catalyzes the action of the play and leads it to its tragic consequences. Explain a little bit more detail, even better. Shakespeare perhaps did this in order too, especially linking it to the Jacobean time, and then rather than a retelling of Cinthio, Shakespeare perhaps his message more clearly is this about jealousy, etc. Miranda, you were writing freely. That's absolutely fine. This is just if you are thinking about how to structure your ideas if you're stuck, right? So if you've already attended university lectures, you've already done university essays, you probably have your own confidence and sense of style in how comfortable you are with starting off an essay. But as we're thinking about A level, we really are thinking about moving from a very formulaic kind of writing in GCSE, where you're kind of told what to write in terms of the order and the structure, etc. Here is just guidance for people who are taking it to their next level and thinking, who perhaps have not written a thesis statement to the level which I imagine you will have done as a university student. So this is just guidance, right? So you don't have to do this at all in this way. Just if you're stuck, if you're looking to improve your thesis statements at all, you certainly can incorporate some of these ideas. Does it have to be this order? Absolutely not. Does it have to be this phrasing? Absolutely not. But if we're thinking about what an examiner is looking for, these are the kinds of things they will expect in your thesis statement. Flair and writing freely absolutely works, but if we're thinking the confined strain of an A-level exam, then that's a slightly different beast. Okay. So I have written a model paragraph for you so that you can see what this actually looks like in person. So in our last 10 minutes of our lesson, I would like to read this out so that you can hear what a full paragraph looks like. Now, of course, this is my own work, and I have been writing paragraphs like this for a long time. So this may be aspirational for you right now, which means that this is what you want to try and make your writing like. It also may be that you are already writing this kind of length and detailed paragraphs, and you're using this rather as a way of challenging yourself to include slightly different details than you're used to including, because everyone does have still their ways of improving their work, right? Even published authors have multiple versions of essays, books, etc. that they need to work and revise. So it's always about developing our craft. So put in the chat anything that you want to borrow, use in your next piece of work. So this paragraph is about, that was one of our ideas, Othello idealizes Desdemona. So this is at the start of the play. Can we link some of the extract into this paragraph and show it as a contrast? Absolutely. Really, the comfort with which you continue to refer back to the extract will really give you a reward in terms of your reader's impression of your essay, whilst also linking it to other parts of the play. 100% Miranda. Cool. So then, evidence. This is what I do for all of my writing, is just put a little bit on the side for what I want to try and include, so that I am thinking of these in terms of patterns rather than just single quotations that I don't necessarily make links together to. So I definitely want to talk about this idealization, the alabaster, statue imagery, celestial imagery of Desdemona, the distance between the two. So Othello as not really looking at, wanting to touch, wanting to spend time really with Desdemona. In fact, even just after he's married her, he wants her to be on a separate boat than him. The candle and the handkerchief as symbols of purity. That would be idealization as well. Martial language, which means military language. So is he thinking of her as this kind of undiscovered other in a kind of potentially conquesty way? An abrupt change in behavior, the white and black imagery, the foreshadowing, etc. So I'm going to read, and I would like you to follow along and to put in the chat any ideas you might have. So, Shakespeare presents Othello and Desdemona's marriage as one in which Othello idealizes Desdemona as a paragon of female virtue. Perhaps it is this idealization that precipitates the tragic collapse of the marriage, as Othello's view and knowledge of Desdemona is a projection of his own insecurity as an outsider in Venetian society that she cannot possibly maintain. So there, just our topic sentence, and then in the second sentence, I always like to link back to Shakespeare's purpose so that we're foregrounding our knowledge of AO3. Here, Shakespeare might attempt to capture the desperate attempts to assimilate that drive outsiders who are continuously conscious of their precarity in an exclusionary and suspicious society, while also suggesting that this love was doomed, as this idealization obfuscates Desdemona's humanity and drives the couple towards disaster. Throughout the play, Shakespeare presents Desdemona as idealized by the male characters. She is divine Desdemona, and full of the most blessed condition, that the idea of her transgression is unthinkable. The celestial and light imagery that surrounds Dian's image and a pearl richer than his whole tribe creates a sense of both delicate but unvarnished perfection, as well as distance. She is both the embodiment of purity and a supernatural figure far removed from the chaos and realities of human life. However, these descriptions of Desdemona also highlight her passivity. She is a being to be adored from a distance but not touched. Thus, the anxieties around the corruption of this perfect Madonna archetype are foregrounded and drive the action of the play, as Iago knowingly exploits both Othello and society's fear of feminine corruption. Thus it is clear that, as De Luca describes, Desdemona becomes the epitome of Jacobean femininity, and further as a male fantasy imposed on women. Thus, Desdemona's seeming perfection is projected onto her by her father, Othello, and wider Venetian society. This becomes a detriment to her, as it is suggested that the male characters in the play, including her father and her husband, do not know her well at all. Her actions and reactions both shock and appall them, and drive them both in tandem to their destruction. In addition, the language of objectification speak to her transactional purpose to the men of the play. She, and chiefly her virginity, are exchanged for men's power and status in society. Thus, her value is intrinsically linked with white imagery of her flame, alabaster, and pearl. Those are all quotations from the extract, so it's starting to address already. This speaks to Breitenberg's comments on masculine identity as dependent on the coercive and symbolic regulation of women's sexuality. Thus, once Brabantio and Othello seemingly lose control of Desdemona's sexuality, they become tarnished socially, but again project this social stain onto Desdemona. Once corrupted, she becomes a strumpet, foul and stained. Thus Desdemona becomes the handkerchief spotted with strawberries that itself serves as a symbol of both Desdemona's innocence and infidelity. The red and white imagery of this key symbol highlight how Othello's view of Desdemona changes across the play, from a handkerchief made of maidens' hearts into the begrimed and corrupted article that proves Desdemona's sin. As Desdemona is obviously innocent, it can be concluded that rather than human love, Othello actually uses Desdemona's power and status in Venice to assuage his gross insecurity, an insecurity that is later reactivated as Othello, conscious of his precarious new place in Venetian society, attempts to preserve it at all costs. Perhaps this is why his language, as he greets Desdemona in Cyprus, is full of foreboding, as he anticipates the unknown fate he appears to fear. He knows that this projected stability cannot last, and thus explains his abrupt change in behavior when he is led to suspect Desdemona, as he seems subconsciously aware that this union is too much of joy. Interestingly, when Othello prepares to murder Desdemona, she becomes again the monumental alabaster of innocence and purity that Othello saw at the beginning. This final scene is rife again with the light imagery and semantic field of possession that speaks to Othello's idealization of Desdemona as a flaming minister, whose light he can restore at will. Thus this image of her and her life is entirely in his hands as he seeks to reclaim this pristine image for himself, and appears successful as his final lines describe her as cold, cold as thy chastity, as she has again become the perfect image of Dian's visage that is finally under Othello's complete control. Here perhaps Shakespeare here presents Othello's idealization of Desdemona as fated because by its very nature it denies Desdemona humanity. Perhaps it has a more didactic purpose in serving as a searing indictment of the impossible restrictions of the Madonna whore complex in Jacobean society, in which women's value served to bolster men's reputation and status and could be both contained and discarded when no longer serviceable. So, thoughts, questions, concerns, ideas, critiques? Feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, it's gone a bit quiet. I'll give people another moment to engage in the chat if they'd like. Of course, again, I said this is aspirational, but feel free to use the ideas from it, use some of the sentence starters, use it as a line of argument. Obviously, copying and pasting it doesn't serve you at all because you don't learn, and also you'll likely get in trouble for plagiarism as this is published on the internet. But feel free to be inspired by it, to draw from the critics, to draw from the quotations, to draw from the arguments as you see fit. And that actually brings us to the end of our lesson today. So I'm happy to hang out for another minute or so if people are still trying to input into the chat, but if people are ready to carry on with their Friday evening and their Halloween celebrations, perhaps feel free to head on your way at this point. Miranda, thank you for that. It only takes practice, right? So as you keep going, this will be much more confident, even if you just take the words you don't know from this paragraph and practice them, look them up, try to use them in your own language. That will be you well on your way to keeping improving and moving forwards for writing, and soon you'll be using them as comfortably as this paragraph does, or as anyone will do in an A-level course. So that is a really ambitious step, but one that I'm sure will help you. Thank you all again. Have a lovely rest of your evening. Next week is half term for my EdSpace, so we will not have lesson next week, but we will start again with lessons on Wednesday the following week, the second week of November. Bye for now.